about a few different things that all kind of combine together to one in most cases where you have a consumer making a dispute with a dealer. And that's sophistication, policies, and due diligence. And what I mean by that, and actually reasonableness is probably another one you could throw into the pot. Here's what happens. In most cases, there's an evaluation made of the sophistication of the consumer versus the dealer. So if a consumer knows nothing about cars, couldn't have discovered a problem, but the dealer should have, and these go to policies, why I mentioned policies and how important they are, inspections, pre-sale inspections, policies on how the dealer prepares a car for sale, on the things that they look at. These are really important to have written down as a policies and procedures, or in a policies and procedures manual, because then a consumer can't say, well, you should have found this, right? Or the dealer should have known of this problem, because the dealer can say, look, we have these policies. This is our 26-point checklist, and that's not one of those things, so it's not something that we would have found. And so then the other piece to that is due diligence and reasonableness. And due diligence is what we call basically the opportunity for the consumer to evaluate the vehicle, perhaps get it inspected like I had mentioned in a previous video, or review a Carfax, test drive, anything the consumer needs to do before buying a car, especially important in an as-is transaction, because the consumer can't always just rely on the reliability of the car knowing, hey, I have a warranty, because they don't. It's as is. So due diligence is real important, but then what happens is in lawsuits, in cases in court and litigation, a lot of times cases boil down to the reasonable person. And none of us really know exactly what a reasonable person is, because there isn't one person that we can go ask and say, hey, you're a reasonable person. You know, how would you have handled this situation, right? That's something that a jury or a judge would interpret. A judge would interpret or determine, what would a reasonable person do in that situation? What would a reasonable consumer have known? What would a reasonable consumer have discovered, right? If a consumer buys a car and the bumper is missing from the car, or there's a huge dent in a quarter panel or something like that, then it's reasonable for the consumer to know that, hey, this car probably has some kind of accident history, or at least a damage history that would cause a reasonable person to investigate. But if the car looks pristine and clean on the outside, is a reasonable consumer going to slide up under a car and look at it before they buy a car? No, probably not, right? Most reasonable consumers don't go that far in their due diligence. So let's say there's a problem that a reasonable consumer would not have discovered. It's very different than a problem that a reasonable consumer would have discovered. So it's important, not only, like I said, to have policies and procedures, but to consider what a reasonable consumer does and treat the consumers like reasonable consumers. So that's just something to keep in mind as a dealer is selling cars to consumers and facing potential, frankly, litigation or demand letters from an opposing attorney or from their consumer regarding that issue. Would a reasonable person have discovered that problem?